Here we go. So this is the first video in the course, Introductory Microbiology. And so the first topic in this video is going to be what is microbiology? And then the rest of lecture one will be 3 or 4 different topics that we really need to cover first so that we can build things on top of those topics. So what is microbiology and what is this course? Well, microbiology is a big collection of fields. It's surprisingly large. It turns out that the biggest scientific conference that happens in the US every year is the microbiology conference that brings together 30,000 researchers, or it used to. And that's because microbiology is a huge collection of fields that are very different from each other. And so people with very different interests can get into microbiology and study microorganisms from very different angles and learn very different things. For example, we have people looking at the early evolution or the recent evolution of microorganisms. And we'll talk more about that as the course goes on. Recent evolution matters because of things like antibiotic resistance or variants of viruses. Ancient evolution matters because we try to understand what are our ancestors. Physiology of microorganisms is how the cells work, how they get energy, how they get nutrition, how they build new cells. And we really need a fundamental understanding of that before we try to understand how we control microorganisms. There are also a lot of people who study microbial ecology, and this is where microbes fit into the world, how they interact with each other, how they interact with other organisms, and how they interact with the environment. And I guess you could put this into environmental microbiology, and that was my first field. We'll talk a little bit about biotechnology. Bacteria, for example, are used to clean up our sewage. Bacteria are used to produce our insulin, and microorganisms are used to produce a lot of other things. We will talk about some of them. And then finally, lots of people study infectious diseases and the pathogens that cause those diseases. So that's how we will end this course, is looking at infectious diseases. So I talked a little bit about this course. This is an introductory course, so that means 2 things. Number 1, we need to get the fundamental concepts that we're going to use to understand microbiology. So we have to get the basic knowledge of microorganisms. That's the first thing. And then the other thing in an introductory course is I want to introduce you to the breadth of the topic so that maybe you're curious about evolution of microorganisms. Well, I want you to know a little bit about it. So we're going to see a lot of this field. We're also going to look at how we study them and how we control them, and then what are infectious diseases. Along the way, we will pay attention to things like scientific rigor. That means using the best possible experimental design. If I want to learn something about the world, I have to find the best way to learn it. And if I use the best possible way, no one will say, oh, you made a mistake and discovered the wrong thing and it's invalid. Scientists are constantly trying to pick apart each other's experiments, trying to undermine each other's experiments. We have to use scientific rigor and do experiments that cannot be undermined. They have to be objectively done the best possible way. Empiricism means doing experiments. It means measuring things in the world instead of just thinking about them. And then the scientific method is how we organize these things. We have a series of steps, starting with a question and then a hypothesis. A hypothesis is where we come up with an explanation about what we think happens in the world or why it happens. And then we design an experiment to test that hypothesis. But before we do the experiment, we make a prediction. We say, well, if my hypothesis is true and I do this experiment, I will get a certain result. If my hypothesis is wrong and I do this experiment, I will get a different result. And so from that prediction, we decide how we're going to analyze the data, and then we do the experiment and sort of go from there. I won't go into any more detail with the scientific method, but I will use words from it, such as hypothesis and theory. And that's it for this first video. I will see you in the next video. So get your coffee and I'll see you there.